This is the work session of the Select Board on July 1st, 2026, which I'll now convene. For those at home or on the road, the directions you need to sign in remotely are on the website. So this afternoon, we are starting off with 4 members of the Select Board. Kevin Galligan, Mary Wright, Meph Runyon, Michael Herman. We have Town Manager Kim Newman, Town Manager Mark Reel, and Laura St. John Dupuy, Executive Assistant. And it looks like Denise is first up here, but we're going to first have our preamble. Yeah.
We acknowledge with respect that we're inhabiting the traditional lands of the Wampanoag peoples who have always existed here. We value their roles as past, present, and future guardians of this land.
Thank you. So first up on the agenda is the review of Select Board policies regarding human resources. Do you want to just
Sure.
take it from here?
I'll start. Thanks for having me here. What I wanted to do today is to provide you an update as a result of our last meeting on June 17th, and also discuss the process of implementing the policies. I want to thank everyone for their valuable feedback during that last session. It was very helpful. And what I did after we met is I talked to our labor attorney. And so we agreed to the following. So the social media policy, we're going to revise that format so that it's consistent with all the other policies. There were some typos that were brought to my attention. We'll take care of those. And then for the drug-free workplace policy, we're going to change some of the language based on the feedback that we got during our last meeting. So the current language states that the violation of the policy shall result in the following personnel actions, and it lists the actions. What we want to do is revise that to state that the violation of the policy may result in one or more of the personnel actions. So we got taken care of that. And then we'll add the word "or" after each personnel action. There was also a question on whether or not off-duty recreational marijuana use is prohibited. So I did discuss with Labor Council, and they recommend that the policy not include the issue of off-duty recreational use of marijuana in the policy. They feel that it'd just be too difficult to monitor, and they recommend keeping silent on that whole issue in the policy. I also consulted with the labor attorney, and his opinion is that in terms of the policies themselves, all personnel policies should be approved by the Select Board, and then the town manager enforces them. So, I asked how he came to that conclusion, and it's outlined in the charter. I'm happy to explain to you where it is in the charter, but he felt that the policies should be approved by the Select Board and then enforced by the town manager. And then I wanted to talk to you about the process as well. So what we should do, the Select Board should approve the policies in the workshop, and then it's subject to impact bargaining. Once that impact bargaining's been completed, then what would happen is the policies would be referred out to the full board for a vote. So that's the information I have to provide you today.
Anybody want to chime in here?
Good. Thank you for clarifying those couple of things that I know we brought up. So
Yes.
that was great. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate the feedback.
Yes, Lynn?
Lynn Bruneau, Seacrest Drive. I kind of late to the game on commenting on this most recent round. I had sent 6 months ago some notes on the original town policies, but I'll send some typo type things directly to Denise, or I'll take them to her to do that offline. But a question I have about some of these, do they apply to members of boards and committees? And the reason I'm asking is because as a member of a board and committee, then I'm covered by the town's insurance. So in a way, there are certain things that apply to me as a member of a board and committee. But then do some of these other HR policies apply to members of boards and committees? And some of this gets kind of gnarly. So maybe somewhere have it confirmed what does or doesn't apply, so it's more clearly understood, because obviously some of this has never been provided to members of boards and committees and so on, and yet things like social media might be useful. See what I'm getting at? So clarity on what does and doesn't apply under certain circumstances would perhaps be helpful. That, you know, sort of like a strategic, and again, I'll give my detailed, small number of type of things directly.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Do you want to respond to that, Denise?
I know the policies that we've discussed in the last two meetings are relative to personnel policies themselves. They're not related to boards or committees, and certainly if that's the route that you all want to go, then they would be separate from these policies here.
Okay. And the question I had whenever I hear the charter requirement come up in a conversation is, does it have to be a charter requirement? Or is it a good thing that it's a charter requirement? I'm just asking.
Well, I know that the charter does say all policies are approved by the select board, so that's, I mean,
That's,
is it good or not? I don't know.
well, that's
It is
fine.
good.
That's the answer. But I just ask that question whenever
Yep.
a charter requirement is brought up in conversation. Then, for the board, this would be our opportunity to agree that we're ready to bring this at our next select board meeting for a vote to approve. Is everybody okay with that?
Well, subject to impact bargaining.
Yeah.
As I had mentioned before.
Okay.
Yeah. So now that this workshop, you've agreed to the policies, we would impact bargain. Once that's done, then it would get recommended out to the full
Okay.
committee.
Okay.
Do all the policies have to be in fact bargained?
Yes,
All of them?
yes.
Okay. So do we need to bring it to the meeting next to say that we're fine to vote to go forward, or is it just a consensus enough at this meeting to say that go with the bargaining and then we'll ratify or whatever at the end?
My thought is, because collective bargaining is binding, I think a vote, even in a work session, would be helpful to then direct Denise to go through that process and then come, as she said, to the full, non-work session meeting. So
Do you want to?
I would make that motion.
Motion?
That the HR policies, the collective ones provided by Denise, including clarifications made now, be voted of support by this board in our work session, subject to impact bargaining, bringing those comments back to the board in a public session.
Second?
And just for clarification, this is a public session.
Well,
So,
but
right.
for a non-work session.
So motion's made and seconded. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. So we'll just wait on you, Denise.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
To Lynn's point, though, about what applies to boards and commissions versus what doesn't, I think that brings us, at some point when we're talking about what the charges and to the committees are and what rules and requirements we have for those board members, we should go back and review which of those policies we think should apply.
Or else have separate policies.
Or no, I'm just saying, pick those and put those in whatever we're giving to members of boards and commissions. So I just think that's a good thing for us to remember as we're thinking about what that total picture looks like, to include something in that.
Will you remember?
I will do my best, absolutely.
All right, thank you very much.
Thanks.
And if not, I know Lynn will remind me.
Come on up, Darren. So this is for the viewing audience, this is now the review of the town's financial policies. Darren Tangeman is walk us through it.
Good evening, Select Board. Tonight, I've put 3 financial policies of the 10 that we'll be reviewing over time tonight. These are pretty heavy ones, but focusing tonight on both the debt policy, the general operating reserve policy, and the enterprise fund policy. And I recommend these intentionally. Obviously, there's a heavy level of community discussion about this last budget season. So I thought these were the most important ones to bring forward to the Select Board for review. First, the debt policy, wanted to include a lot of different new elements into it in terms of debt affordability standards directly affecting investor confidence, rating agency review, and borrowing costs. Also wanted to provide a real clear metric in terms of restoring a clear debt to service expenditure framework. Because it was brought up during our S&P borrowing call with S&P in terms of our debt profile, and so it was something that they recommended that we return to. And after, as everyone knows, after a lot of discussion and research on it, we made a recommendation to staff to put a ceiling at 20%, and we'll talk about that in the policy, but having a target range between 17 and 19%. So that's kind of the big picture there. We also looked at general operating reserve, the fact that it reserve policy protects our liquidity, supports our town credit profile, and helps to ensure one-time reserves do not become a recurring operating source. I wanted to make sure that we had some really good definitions in there, and also kind of reworked a way to look at both the stabilization fund and free cash so that we meet what is generally a national standard by GFOA, the Government Finance Officers Association, in terms of minimum unfunded UFBR, which is an unrestricted fund balance reserve requirement that they typically place on, they recommend for most municipalities across the country. And then finally, the third priority tonight, looking at the enterprise fund reserve or fund policy. And looking at it kind of in a new way. There's some things that I saw on it that I was a little concerned about. The retained earnings definitions and how they were being defined, and it was a concern. The laws have changed over time, and it was important that we modernized it and really had a better definition of what that is and how it's used. And also looking at how much we subsidize those issues. Those funds, and looking at how we might look at reducing our subsidy to some of those over time, because we need to make our operating budget sustainable over time, and the more we subsidize, the less that we can do with our normal operating budget if the enterprise funds need subsidy. So that being said, you have the debt policy in your packets. I just want to kind of go over. There's no request to make a decision tonight, but I want to be here to answer any questions. I want to talk about the big recommendations in the policy and the rationale behind why I made those recommendations. First, we added language that the rating agencies evaluate both the existence and formal financial policies and the town's adherence to those policies. It's important. Mary, I know that we talked about this too from a debt profile perspective, and that this is important to understand that what S&P expects from us in terms of how we enforce these policies. And then going down to change the debt service to expenditure guidelines, we added a target range of between 17 to 19% at a maximum ceiling of 20% of the annual debt service as a percentage of the annual governmental expenditures. And I'll talk more about how that is defined as well, because it's important to define what we consider governmental expenditures as the denominator for that. And then going down to change the calculation method that is clarified again, using a total annual budget debt service, including general fund debt, debt excluded debt, tax supporter wastewater debt, short-term borrowing costs, and original school debt divided by the total annual operating budget. We will exclude, the intent's to exclude CPA-supported debt and debt paid entirely for enterprise or legally restricted non-general fund revenues, so that we know each year we have a clear definition of how we're calculating that, because that wasn't clear in the previous. We're kind of just winging it a little bit, and I say that we had a formal practice, but we didn't have it defined formally in policy. And then equalized valuation and statutory debt capacity section added. We require annual report of equalized valuation. This just helps just to be an additional metric within the debt policy that shows that we're complying with the state requirements for the equalized valuation and what we can borrow as a result of that. We didn't have that in there, and I think it's a comment that's made each year, like how much can we borrow? I think it's important the community knows how much we can borrow, and we're not getting to that point. We're not even really close to it. So it's important to have that in there so that they understand. And then a couple of things that I added to this, and this is tied to how the community was engaged on this issue this last year, and the Finance Committee had a number of comments about it as well. And that's to do an annual debt affordability report each year. And that and I put this on myself at the finance department for the town manager, but really looking at a 10-year capital plan already provides a lot of this information. But the addition of this will ensure that the debt affordability is reviewed in one place during the budget and capital planning process, so that we have that. We knowingly provide that as part of the planning process for the budget. And then providing an exception for the 20%, going above the 20% expenditure, debt to expenditure ratio, and having a formal process with the select board, having to, approve that if we exceed it, so that there's a formal process for that.
Just quick, Darren, when it says the select board may recommend borrowing, who is the select board recommending that to?
Essentially, it's a recognition that we're going to exceed the 20%, and the select board it's having them acknowledge it publicly that we're going above our policy, so that you're making a decision that we're going to exceed the 20%.
The select board is the authority to actually authorize that.
Yes. So, I'm not saying you're authorizing it, because it's going to have to go to the town meeting
That's my question.
formal authorization, but you're acknowledging that we're exceeding that in the budget process if we do it, so that when it goes to town meeting, we knowingly are, exceeding the policy.
But at that time, we can decide not to also.
Yeah, no, and the reason why it's there is we want to preserve our AAA bond rating, right? So, if we exceed, I'm not saying we're going to lose our AAA bond rating if we exceed the 20%, but we're getting to a risky point at that. And so if the public is saying, here's our current debt situation, we still want the library built right now, and it's going to force us to exceed our 20%, you're going to have to make a public, this is a policy decision, right? You're going to have to say, yes, we're going to do it. Even though we may lose our AAA bond rating, and debt may cost us more to get, right? So borrowing might be more costly as a result of that. So it puts a policy kind of framework together for you, so that and a backstop, so that you can make a more informed decision for the community.
Mr. Chair, I would just add, if I could, I think the library, just as a hypothetical, was one example, but I think embedded in the language is in the case of emergency. God forbid,
Yeah.
a major disaster affecting the shoreline. We are going over 20% to repair,
Yeah.
subject to outside funding and all that stuff. But I kind of picked up more on the,
Emergency.
disaster strikes.
Yeah, I just throw that out there because I know that was a discussion last year a little bit. So you're exactly right. I think, those are the easier ones that that you have to do. But placing a backstop there so that you have to make a formal decision on it. We haven't exceeded 20%, and I don't know if I have to look back, but I don't think we've exceeded that in 20 or 30 years. So I think we're in it still. It's not something that I would expect. It's not something I would expect to recommend as the finance director either, so it's just there. Okay.
My only feedback, because a lot of this Lynn and I did a year ago, is about this one piece of wording.
Sure.
Right? Because we got sort of tripped up on this 2 years ago, which is about the town shall endeavor to maintain a certified free cash at 3 to 5%. The DLS, the language is strive to generate, right? Because what that wasn't interpreted at for them in the past, which is why they were so restricted, is that they would keep 3 to 5% of free cash set aside, unavailable to use, and that's not the case. It's just that what we're striving to generate annually in free cash is 3 to 5%.
Yeah, that is, I think, the language that is used. I think that what GFOA says is 16.67% should be retained as a reserve. So you can, you have the flexibility between the stabilization fund and the free cash to get to that 2 months of operating
But it's,
revenue.
they were, like, basically, they just don't wanna put aside too much money,
Yeah.
borrow when they have money sitting in reserve. And this 3 to 5% was really the crux of how we got tripped up last time. So just the understanding, and it's what I've told the finance committee too, which is that we're striving to generate that percentage. If it's more than that, then something's clearly wrong. We've either over budgeted or brought in more revenue or something like that. That's the safe parameter. So when you're looking for a measure as a regular citizen of how we're doing on our budgeting, the free cash really does tell us, what that number should be.
And that being said, there are some instances when it's not the result, it's a result of some other state agencies. For instance, we've had this issue with DEP withholding payment on some funds for us that reduced our free cash. So, it's not always dependent on even staff or operational spending. So, okay.
Excellent.
Yeah, can I just ask another question, Darren?
Sure.
'Cause this has been a longstanding sort of point for me, is, which is more important to focus on, debt service or principal, principal balance of debt. And when we get into this, which seems to try to clarify and make more visible the debt service element, how does that show up annually? Is that part of the budget process that there'll be a footnote saying that this ratio is for this budget so much?
I mean, we will provide that's it's part of the budget process, and that's part of the reporting, right, that we have there as well. Annual debt affordability report is that we will provide that to the select board and the community so they know where we're at in terms of that number and that it'll help be a guiding point also for how we structure the budget as well, right? So one of the things, again, the CPA, those are revenue bonds that come out of the CPA funds. We've excluded those because those aren't necessarily directly impacting taxpayer, the tax rate, right? So it's a separate element. So we kept that out of there as well. But the intent is to really is to give the community a good understanding of where we stand with it when we're providing the budget for review at that time, and because there's going to be some debt decisions that'll have to be made. I hope. I mean, to be honest, we're going to get far enough out in the capital planning process that these decisions won't be a surprise. I think we'll have we'll have this 10-year plan with these other capital items further out to 20 years, but are more defined in terms of cost 10 years out. I don't foresee a lot of surprises unless. But the issue again is always that these are all political and policy decisions. They can always change based on who's on the select board and how town meeting votes. So we want to be able to still be able to provide those metrics to the community so they can make an informed decision. That makes sense. Yeah.
So just on that subject of debt service, it's always been a little bit confusing about how we treat the CPC
Yeah.
debt and water department debt. And in wastewater, we had all these sort of elements that are out there. We have the stabilization fund that we created that was earmarked for wastewater debt. But, you know, do those get brought into this calculation, or are they just separate from it?
And well, when we talk about the enterprise fund, we'll talk more about like how we move forward with that. But it does intentionally kind of set that outside of this, because the enterprise funds are intended to kind of fund their own debt in a way. But yeah, so I think those questions will be answered when we talk about the enterprise fund policy. But there is, when I say that, the stabilization fund currently funds, there's a lot of conversation that needs to be had about how the stabilization, the occupancy tax is used moving forward, and how we potentially off-ramp taxpayers' subsidy to wastewater over time. And that's part of the Waterworth discussion right now that the consultants are having with Rich and the wastewater department. So in the policies, you'll see kind of an off-ramp discussion about how we move forward with that, with the intent to, you know, get away from subsidy in the future. So,
And I guess I'm asking this question because what I'm hoping we're going to end up with is a number both on debt service and on debt principal balances that is the cast in stone number that will be used by everyone, whether it be staff, select board, or town committees. There won't be any room for sort of finding different balances than what
well,
are in the.
agreed. And I think that's why I try to define what's being used and what's not being used in your policy, so that everyone can point to that. Agreed. I think that was a concern prior. Yeah.
So if I could add, Mr. Chair.
So
So you're trying to hope that individual volunteers on committees don't feel the need to take it on themselves to develop elaborate spreadsheets with wrong information.
Or entitled, or entitled.
So if I could also continue, I think the point you raised about, you know, what's in the debt calculation, Darren nailed it very solid. That's the one area I highlighted the most, is so important to let people understand. You know, there's debt service that comes out of the general fund, but then there are other debt services that are parked and covered, you know, and, you know, people should not roll them all up, because there've been votes taken at town meetings, there've been active decisions through grants or other forms that have those things on a separate track. So I think, you know, a lot of people will have a difficult time understanding when you get to the affordability report, but I think it's important to match those, Darren, with, again, reminder, whether you do a footnote on those, to say what the debt service calculation is. Because it's, I think, going to be the biggest nut to kind of remind people on over and over again. Is they're going to say, well, it's all the debt. Well, yes, the town signed on to debt. However, you know, it just, and if I could, Mr. Chair, while I've got the floor and you're going to enterprise funds, I sent Darren just a couple of minor edits, but one thing in the highlight under the enterprise funds, I don't mind the language, but I think somebody shouldn't take this to say we expect enterprise funds to be 100% on user fees and revenues, where the line says enterprise funds should generally be supported by users' revenues. We know the history with the transfer station, and I do not see a day ever that there's not going to be, nor should we want to see 100% put on the fees, only because that's a health and safety matter. We don't want people throwing their trash down the banks along the highway. You know, we want to match the market in such a way that people can afford to get the sticker. You know, I bought for 2 vehicles, and, you know, between beaches and transfer, $300. You know, for me, that's okay, but not for everybody. So I do think with the words generally, people should not expect that we're never going to continue subsidy, because I think transfer station is always going to have some subsidy.
I mean, there's some,
Safety issue.
sorry, yeah, I mean, if I.
Go ahead.
I think, and I actually had this conversation with Meph about this as well, is like, there's probably a conversation, I mean, I know there's, obviously we have different, I mean, it's a hard conversation, because I think some of the community members, some, like Brewster, for instance, do it differently, right? And so there's a conversation about whether it pay as you throw, right? So there's a conversation of whether or not we would move to that, which would change it. There's a conversation about These are bigger conversations, these are policy conversations, not my conversation, that, consider that, because I will say that, early on, and I'll say that in the next week or so, we're gonna have our, complete our 5-year expenditure and revenue forecast for the town. Obviously, Kim needs to see that beforehand, and there will be a significant disparity in terms of revenues. I say significant. It's significant enough that would have an impact. So do we want to continue to fund a enterprise that could potentially fund itself? I know there's the policy, this concern about if it's too high, will people start throwing trash and on the road? So there's a lot to think about with that. So
And just on a historical note, when we, as a board, authorized the enterprise funds to begin with, which goes back now probably 7 or 8 years, this discussion was one of the central parts of the debate, and I think we approved it with the understanding that we were not expecting that the enterprise funds would be expected to be self-funding. So there is that history too, and I agree. I don't see the day that the transfer station becomes self-funding ever. Maybe the beaches, but.
Exactly.
again, not my choice, not my decision.
Yeah, I agree with Kevin's addition there and comment, but I also do see that we can move closer to
It's a good
not
aspiration.
having a subsidy.
Yeah.
I mean, just to say that we're never going to get there. I don't think people are going to throw trash down the highway. That's not my worry. But I do think we can come closer to maybe 90%. I don't know. I don't know what the number is. But I think we definitely need to have these discussions, because the whole point of the enterprise fund and the philosophy behind it was to have them self-generating. So,
Well, and let's just say that there should, this is, they talk about an off-ramp discussion, right? There needs to be some metric that generates a need to have a review of the fees, right? So if it's $500,000, like what, or $100,000 or 10% or whatever it might be, right? There needs to be some metric that generates a need to discuss this make recommendations for fee changes to offset the cost to the general fund. And so that's kind of the intent, I think. What percentage that is, and I will say in the enterprise fund discussion, which I haven't gotten to yet, there is a conversation about like not all funds are not all enterprise funds are made the same. A 10% requirement, it shouldn't necessarily be 10% across all funds. So in terms of retained earnings. And so, real quick, the last thing that I missed.
Darren,
Sorry, one
Okay,
question.
sorry.
So if I'm reading this correctly, but we've never issued enterprise fund, we've never issued revenue debt. All of our debt is actually GO bonds, correct? None of the only reason I'm asking is, in thinking about how the debt service percentage is calculated, you're saying here, if I'm reading this right, is that when we have dedicated revenues, right, to pay the bonds, we're not including that in the debt service to expenditure calculation.
Right now, well, some of the we're cash funding some of the capital with it.
Exactly.
So,
yeah.
right, but all I'm saying is so I guess it's just, revenue bonds, when you issue revenue bonds, you obviously pull it out and nobody cares, right? Because they're looking at, that's gone, or it's dedicated revenue, so it doesn't affect your doesn't affect the general obligations. So I'm just wondering and so I can see as a debt analyst, right, I would say, okay, great, I see that, the Community Preservation Act supported stuff is over here, but push comes to shove, if for some reason the CPA funds vanish, I don't know why it would be, it's still a GO bond.
Right.
It's still, it still has to come back to the town obligation. So I guess as long as that's sort of explained within how S&P would look at this, then, then that's fine. But it's not really a true measure in the sense that if the enterprise funds don't get collected, the general fund would be hit for that obligation.
Yeah, that's a true statement because, and I don't think you can characterize a CPA as a revenue bond for that purpose because
right.
you can't necessarily mess with the fees to compensate for the revenue bond service. So you're right, and in fact, in my research, I don't think I call it a revenue bond but I do separate it because there is absolute consistency, a lot of consistency in terms of how much CPA funding we received, and the intent is to keep. They don't want to borrow more than they can service.
Correct.
Yeah, agreed. It
I'm not
is generally a
disagreeing-
GO.
I'm not disagreeing with what
Yeah.
you're doing, as long as it's explained and saying, okay, yes, we
Yeah.
are pulling that out because we know that there's these funds that are coming in. But I think, if push comes to shove, the general fund is responsible to pay for it.
You're right. Yes, that's right.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay. Last, before I take more questions, I forgot to, I also we did put some more language in terms of band practice, how we use bands in the debt policy, so that there's an understanding that we, reflects what Orleans already does in terms of our existing practice, but avoids issuing permanent debt too early when project costs may still be changing, which has been our common practice, but we never defined it. And so now we've defined it because had some questions this last year about it. And so this is about not only policies that define us, but help the community help understand how we use these funds and how we use debt. So, yes. Any other questions related to the debt policy?
Good.
All right. I'll move on to the general operating reserve policy. I'm sorry, we kind of already started on the general operating reserve policy, but I guess we'll move. Is there any questions that you have? I'll keep on going because we had already kind of kicked into the general operating reserve and went back to debt. Let's see. Like I said, in there I had annual reserve compliance in terms of requiring myself to report annually to the select board on free cash, general stabilization, combined reserve percentage, plan uses, and policy compliance. So that is another piece of it, so that there is a backstop in many ways to discussing, because we really, we make recommendations. We don't necessarily discuss these policies that we obviously are making the decisions or making the recommendations based on the policies, but sometimes we kind of miss them if we don't do some kind of reporting on them. And then I also make a recommendation in terms of if we go below the percentages, like what is the target restoration for those and how quickly should we restore those so that we have reserves in case of an emergency. This year, and I go, what's not said in here is like, if there is an emergency, a lot of people, the state often will say, oh, we'll bail you out. The truth is that's not the case. It could take as much as 2 months. What we've seen is it could take as much as 2 months for them to get us the funds we need to pay our staff, right? If we lost all revenue. So that's why you have 2 months of revenue, so that you can retain that cash flow to be able to do that. So that is what, I know the state likes to, they do a great job in terms of maintaining the highest number of AAA bond rated communities in the country. Massachusetts is that state, because they micromanage the communities at such a level that we don't get there. But they also like to say that they can cover us in an emergency, which is why they say don't keep too much of a free cash or a reserve. But in reality, they've never been able to meet a quick response to an emergency that's under 2 months. So how do we meet that? We do it with a reserve. So that's my comment on that. Okay. With that, is there any questions or concerns about my recommendations for the general operating reserve policy? Okay. All right. All right, the enterprise fund policy, which sounds like there's, the intent here is really to make recommendations. I do have, I do have concerns about next year's budget in terms of expenditures and revenues that we'll have to address in the budget itself. And so, one of the big drivers of the offset is that we have to subsidize enterprise funds. It could be as much as a third of what we're looking at in terms of having to adjust for next year. So that's a big number. So that's why I bring this up this is a conversation that sounds like there's some different perspectives on how do you off-ramp from general fund subsidy. And there's different perspectives in the community, different perspectives from the select board on which ones we look at and how much. So anyways, so in this, the big changes that I made are add goals I added a goal for full cost recovery, reduced or eliminated recurring tax level subsidy. That obviously is an opinion that's not shared by everybody on the select board. So there would be a request to that's something to consider or discuss, and how we potentially establish, and I could bring back recommendations in terms of what that off-ramp might look like, if that's a question, or it could be wholly removed. It's just that I put it in there for a discussion point from a policy perspective. There was an update to the list of the enterprise funds because this hadn't been updated since the moorings in Rock Harbor had been removed, so that's just an admin thing that needs to be removed.
Mr. Chair, can I interrupt very quickly on that?
Yeah.
I know it's not truly defined as an enterprise fund, but it acts like one, is the water reserve.
Yeah.
So it's almost like you want to footnote this to
Yeah.
say, and the water reserve, although not a enterprise fund, really acts and follows these steps as well. I mean, they really do. I mean,
It's a special revenue account.
right.
Yeah.
But they do asset management. They project their needs. They look at fees and rates. Very similar to what, it's just they didn't call it back when they were formed an enterprise fund. But, I mean,
Yeah, there's,
Tricky, because the water revenue is part of the general fund,
yeah.
right?
That's
So
true, too.
It doesn't act in the same way, doesn't have the same limitations as the revenue that comes in from the enterprise funds. I mean, you could theoretically put some target amount that you feel comfortable keeping to maintain the reserve, but I mean, that just provides extra guardrails that, it's very tricky. But like, just to give you an example, we added, when we were working to hire the outreach for the water sewer, sort of water sewer health, in that first year, we were able to fund the implementation of that, some from water and some from health, right? Because we had funding in both.
Yeah.
But
it just,
Well, it's yeah. And this is, and I can see Mark's face in this because we went through the budget process with this. The indirect cost discussion with enterprise funds. I clearly, part of this is me clearly defining what the indirect cost process is, so that we understand that. We do take indirect costs from the water fund to fund the budget, so that would have to align as well. I mean, we took, I think, almost $3 million this last year from water fund for indirect costs. So is that right? I think so. Yeah. So that's a lot, and trying to adjust, because obviously the staff that's supporting it is our staff, right? So that's a big reason why. So it's not all equal in terms of what when we separate that. So anyways, that's a big thing. The indirect costs are something that I try to intentionally define here, because we have a practice, but not a defined practice. And so that's one of the changes that I put in the enterprise.
I jump in
fund
here
policy.
too.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a larger question, and you guys were talking about it already, about what level you're subsidizing or not. If your intention is to continue to subsidize with the general fund, then the larger question there is, why have enterprise funds at all?
Yeah.
Because the indirect costs only exist because you are charging the general fund for use within those enterprise funds. If the beach is never going to be self-sustaining, you're only adding extra administrative work when all of this revenue could be coming into the general fund, and then we do no indirect costs. So like, that's the larger question. It's why are you doing it? And I think it's to justify the rates that you charge, but you could do that anyway without having the parameters of an enterprise fund, right? You could just do the calculations. So that's great, I mean, go this way, but the larger question is why, right? So, and if it's a.
So my memory of the why
Yeah.
was to pull out the certain activities that the town is doing in such a way that people could see that that it costs $500,000 a year for the town to fund the beaches after everybody's fees are paid and everything like that. And so it was really just to be able to see it as an accounting sort of illustration.
Which you could say, beach costs $2 million to run, brings in $1 million in revenue, that you could, without all the extra. I'm sorry, Kevin, I don't mean to cut you off. My main concern around it is the future borrowing that we'll need to do for an administration building for the beaches. And that will have to be subsidized from the general fund, because there's no way that you can pay for that within the beach. So that becomes an even more confusing conversation, which is like, much like the other ones that we're already covering the debt of, like, why are we continuing in this way? I mean, you could just set rates based upon what other towns are setting and call it a day, right? If it's not gonna.
This discussion about the indirects is so wonky.
Yeah.
Really is. It's trying to say, okay, we have costs that we know support this. What's fair, what's not, it's always wrong. But to Kim's point, you know, if all you want to do is have transparency, Munis, as we remember back when a few of us were on just finance committee, the town presented in a way that you could isolate the revenue and cost without calling them enterprises.
Right.
Look at those budgets 8, 9 years ago. They showed separate looks of what the costs and revenues were for the operations of the beach, of the transfer, without calling them enterprise. So maybe there comes a day that we've learned enough and the benefits don't outweigh the costs.
Especially if you, I mean, if you have strong feelings about the transfer station because of the public safety issues. And we know that the beach has costs coming that we will never be able to charge adequately to that fund. So,
Legitimately, the wastewater department might be the only true enterprise that,
yeah, right.
Water
like,
reserve.
water reserve, yeah.
Right. It's, so.
I guess, you know, my experience is, the only time I ever thought of having an enterprise fund is when you were going to issue debt against the enterprise fund. I mean, that was, you know, why you had it, was because it was your water and sewer department, and you were gonna issue revenue debt. And so you had to have the separate enterprise fund, which said it was not coming out of it was not a GO bond. And so therefore,
True.
you had it all separate, and that was fine. And that's, you know, and so you could have a complete, it was just clean.
Right.
So it's just as an observer, I've never understood why to have an enterprise fund if it wasn't self-sustaining. Because it sort of defeats the purpose of going through the
Correct.
mechanics.
I think it's Kim's point
Right.
about the beach fund.
Right.
And it's, I mean, and it's usually under the guise, right, of transparency, which is people will say, why am I paying a beach fee when I'm already paying taxes? And then you have to explain, well, the beach only brings in X, and if we had to raise the rate of the beach to cover the cost, then the rate would be Y. And nobody wants that, and is it fair to charge it's that conversation. And having inherited what you're talking about, what did you say about the indirect costs? I would say, it's not that they were never right, it's that they were our best estimates of whatever on that year to fit into the numbers that we had. So, and that's how you've been operating since this started. So it's not as if these have added any value to you in terms of accountability and accuracy. They have created a ton of extra work
Yeah.
in debate on the floor about what the value is, and transparency and accountability, right? So, what people think they should be doing, right? Like, they're not doing any of that, but we will continue to go in whichever way you'd like.
We have 3 paragraphs that Darren's tried to make it more clear on indirect cost.
Yeah, and we have a practice, an internal practice. Cedric's in here. He's want to help with verifying the numbers this year for our enterprise indirect costs. We have a general practice. I just wanted to define it because it really wasn't truly defined in there. So that's what that's there for. Additionally, we have a subsidy disclosure requirement in here because we haven't. There's been a lot of questions that have come out. How much are we subsidizing? I know it came from the finance committee a lot. Because it's not quite clear how much we are. There's a percentage there, but just having a public disclosure how much and that brings an additional conversation about why are we subsidizing, and it's an enterprise fund. So then there comes a question, but it also helps Kim's argument in that that we're being transparent about it to the community so they see it. So there's more debate about it and whether or not we continue with it as an enterprise fund. So there's that. The beach methodology is updated. In there, I mean, in terms of clarifying the beach should cover its direct. So I have this discussion about all 3 funds in terms of and this is a piece that sounds like it should change a little bit. I mean, the intent was to have a conversation exactly what we're doing in terms of what's the future of these enterprise funds in the policy. Should we continue where we're going in terms of subsidizing them? And how should we define them? I put recommendations. It doesn't sound like this is a conversation to have, maybe not today, but at least bringing it so we can define it in the policy when it's approved, how you want to define it for all of these, because they're all a little bit different. And then the transfer station methodology, again, that's a big one, right? That's the one that's probably the most in question, and that we subsidize the biggest of all of these. I think it was almost $500,000 this last year. So that's a conversation. And then looking about the balances of full cost recovery as it pertains to that, that's a whole different structure. I don't think you'd use the sticker approach. You'd have to do a pay-as-you-throw approach to even come close to that, and that's apparently not
Yeah.
a consensus in the community. So that's that. Those are kind of those considerations. Now, and then I put some comments in there about the sewer methodology because, and this is the part that Kevin he wanted to make sure we talked about, and this is just about that we're in a period of development and expansion with wastewater, so that the community understands that, and that we're kind of in a transition about how we fund debt and how we fund the enterprise, but how do we move in a direction where it becomes more self-sustaining in the future. All right. Let's see, bigger ones. I also wanted to clarify retained earnings. It wasn't clear in terms of the definition of retained earnings, so I wanted to modernize that. So the community understood, uses proper Massachusetts Enterprise Fund terminology and avoids implying retained earnings or unrestricted general fund resources that could be used for operating. A lot of it's about there's very specific purposes for retained earnings under Mass General Law, and I talk about that later on. But and then talking about replacing a rigid universal 10% retained earning target for fund-specific retained earnings or working capital targets, using a 10% only as an interim benchmark until fund-specific targets are established. And that's a conversation as we go in and evaluate all of the enterprise funds this year for structural budget deficits, that we look at what that retained earnings, what's a reasonable retained earnings level for each one of the independent enterprise funds, and not just keeping it at 10%, because it works for some, doesn't work for others. And then looking at the permitted uses of retained earnings, making sure that's clarified. That goes back to what I was saying. Allowed certified retained earnings for emergency or extraordinary expenses, capital projects and equipment, debt reductions, rate stabilizations, the big one that's in the statute, reserve replenishment, temporary revenue shortfalls, and other one-time enterprise needs. This gives staff, the board, a clear list of appropriate uses tied to the enterprise purposes. Because as we were going through the budget process, I got the impression that if we're short on operating expenses, we could just dip into it, and that's not the way the statute intends. So, looking at the indirect cost aligned, again, we already talked a lot at length that the indirect costs using the DLS guidance as our structure for recommending a reasonable, documented, and consistently applied indirect cost methodology. And then also, if you look below that, that it's net of debt proportional allocation. So it's that we're not, debt service does not usually drive administrative workload. So excluding debt from the proportional allocations avoids overstating overhead for capital-intensive funds such as wastewater. So that's why it's net of debt for that. And there's a number of other things, but they're smaller in nature. But those are the big ones that I really wanted to touch on, and I'm here to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Darren. Committee members, we're up against the clock here a little bit. What is the next steps here with this?
I haven't heard much opposition to anything other than really the portion, the concept of the enterprise funds subsidy piece. And so I can bring back an off-ramp discussion about that at the next meeting, and I have 7 other policies to bring you for review too. But in the meantime, that's the focus I think that I'm hearing.
Yeah,
Kim?
that's
Yeah.
good.
So we'll wait until all the financial policies that come through the work
Yeah, that
session
makes the most
before it goes
sense.
on? Yeah, okay.
And I'll develop a subsidy off-ramp discussion for all 3 independent ones so that we can have a more detailed discussion about that. Okay.
Thank you.
Nice job, Darren.
So we do need to get on here. The only thing that's on this agenda that we have people here for is the Human Services Advisory Committee charge. And I'm not sure where we're at with that.
We could
You
wait.
should have had a,
It's in-
Yes,
have a,
right. So I guess whatever,
Want to walk us through it, maybe?
okay,
Or
Mark.
Mike? I don't know. Up to you.
But
Quickly.
I guess,
I guess,
Yeah, we are.
maybe are there questions?
we
for
really,
the
we
board?
really
We
need to
start
sort of
with that.
wrap this up.
We really have to stop.
Yeah. Now, the work session.
Yeah, so apologies, but we're gonna have to get to this at our next session.
May I
Sure.
say something? Okay. Susan Chandler, 7 Salt Work Circle, and I'm Chair of the Human Services Committee. I know that you're starting a new process and reviewing all of the charges, and I appreciate the opportunity that we're on your agenda. However, we would hope for a somewhat more collaborative process so that as you're editing the charges that our committee has given to you a year and a half ago, that we would get back a version that we could share with the committee to give you an opportunity to hear the committee's input before it goes for decision. And I understand there is an edited version, but it hasn't been shared with me yet, and I would appreciate that, and so would my committee.
Okay,
Thank you for the opportunity to share.
I would just add very quickly that the plan was that we would have the board review, any additional comments would be added to the draft and then sent out so that committee members could, over the next 2 weeks between the workshop and the final vote, provide any comments that the board could then review and see if there was something missed.
so what you're saying is that before we send anything out to the committee, we're gonna have a work session review first, okay? So I think we'll get to where you wanna go, but I'm not sure what the timing will be.
Because we haven't been able to hear the comments of the board to send a draft for the committee to see it.
Okay, so I think we need to have a motion to end this meeting.
So So moved.
Second?
501.
At 5:01, okay, all in favor, say aye.
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 Aye.